He had a system, and I was the last name on his list. I sat in the back of the fellowship hall, with a paper cup of cold coffee in my hands, and I watched him work the room the way I had once watched 100 men like him work 100 rooms. A hand on a shoulder here, a soft word there, a laugh that always arrived a half second before the joke was funny. Because a laugh like that isn't about the joke. It's about making you feel chosen. He moved through those grieving women like a man wading through still water. Pearl, Geneva, Dot Hagen, who had buried her Raymond in the spring. He bent close to each of them, and each of them tilted up toward him like flowers that hadn't seen the sun in a long while. And I understood exactly what he was doing, because loneliness is the cheapest doorway in the world, and he had a key cut for every one of us. He saved me for last, the oldest widow in the room, the freshest grief, the biggest check. He thought he was being patient, saving the best for himself. When he finally turned and started across that floor toward me, smiling, I folded my hands in my lap like the harmless old thing he believed me to be. He had read every widow in that church. He never read my resume. My name is Margaret, and to understand how a man like Dale Renner ended up standing in a room full of people learning exactly who I was, you have to go back 8 months to the worst morning of my life. That was the morning I reached across the bed, and Harold wasn't there. 41 years I'd reached across that bed and found him. He went in his sleep, no pain, and they meant it as a kindness. But there is a cruelty in losing someone gently, because there's no warning to brace against. One night I had a husband, and the next morning I had a house too big and a coffee pot that made twice what I needed. The casseroles came first. Then the cards. Then the phone calls thinned out. Because grief makes other people uncomfortable. And after a while, the only place left that still seemed to want me was the church on Bellamy Road, where I'd sung in those pews for 30 years. I was the quiet one there, the one who brought the lemon bars and never made a fuss. I had the kind of face people forget the moment they look away from it, and a stillness people mistook for simpleness. I let them. I'd spent my whole working life letting men underestimate me. By 73, I'd made an art of it. Now I have to tell you what I did for those working years, because Dale never asked, and because you should know what he was walking toward. For 38 years, I was an investigator for the State Securities Division. Affinity fraud was my unit, the schemes that hunt people through their churches, their lodges, their old neighborhoods, the cons that take a community's love and turn it into a weapon pointed inward. I sat across from more Dale Renners than I could count. I learned their grammar. I wrote the training manual the young examiners still used, the one with the chapter on how these men always find the lonely first. I'd retired 4 years before I lost Harold, and I never told the church a word of it, because when you've spent your life among the worst version of people, you guard the quiet years that are left. So when Dale Renner crossed that fellowship hall toward me with his patient smile, he saw a freshly bereaved widow with a fat insurance check and a forgettable face. He had no idea he was walking toward the one woman in that building who had spent 4 decades putting men exactly like him out of business. I have to tell you about the pen, too, because the pen matters. It was a heavy black fountain pen with a worn gold band, and Harold gave it to me the day I came home and told him I'd been hired. He took both my hands and said, "Margaret, a woman who's going to spend her life getting men to sign their own names had better have a pen worth signing with." I carried that pen for 38 years, and after he died I carried it in my coat pocket every single day, because it was the last warm thing I had left of him. Hold on to that pen. You'll want to remember it. Now, Dale Renner did not arrive at our church as a salesman. They never do. He arrived as a blessing. His mother had passed, he told everyone, and grief had brought him back to the Lord and back to a small congregation where people still knew each other's names. He had a warm, unhurried voice, and a gift for the little things: your knee replacement, your grandson's baseball, the hymn you'd ask the choir to sing. And when old Mr. Pruitt went into the hospital, Dale sat with him 3 nights running so the family could sleep, and never mentioned it to a soul. I found that out later, and I'll be honest, I've spent my whole life studying men like Dale Renner. And even I had to sit with that one. Because it was real. He really did sit with a dying man in the dark for no profit at all. That's the thing nobody warns you about. The good ones aren't all bad. That's what makes them good at it. Within 2 months, Dale Renner was the most beloved man in our congregation, and the woman who loved him most, who vouched for him hardest, was Sister Geneva, who had run our choir for 40 years. If Geneva said a thing was sound, the whole church believed it. And Geneva believed in Dale with her whole heart, because Dale had taken her little nest egg, $11,000, the leftovers of a cafeteria pension, and 3 months later handed her a check for $900 and called it her first quarterly dividend. Geneva stood up at a potluck and waved that check in the air and said the Lord had finally sent somebody who cared about the little people. She didn't know she was bait. She wasn't lying to anyone. And that is the whole engine of the machine. You don't need the con man to convince the widows. You just need him to convince Geneva. And then Geneva convinces the widows, for free, out of love. The man who first walked Dale through our door, though, was my husband's nephew, Gary, Harold's sister's boy, who'd spent his life chasing the easy dollar one disappointment at a time. Gary had met Dale at one of those hotel ballroom seminars, the kind with a free steak dinner, and a man at the front promising the secret the banks don't want you to know. Gary came out a believer, and Dale, I'd later learn, paid him a quiet finder's fee for every soul he brought through the door. And his own aunt, sitting on Harold's life insurance, was the fattest finder's fee of all. So Gary started coming around Gary, who hadn't called me once in the 4 years before Harold died, suddenly unable to do enough for his poor Aunt Margaret. He'd sit at my kitchen table and tell me I was a foolish old woman letting money rot in a savings account, that inflation was eating Harold's legacy alive, that Dale Renner was a gift from God. And when I asked questions, he'd pat my hand the way you pat a dog. Don't you worry about the details, Aunt Margaret. That's what Dale's for. You just have to trust. You just have to trust. I'd heard that sentence in courtrooms, in hospital lobbies and church basements, and 100 sworn statements. You just have to trust is the 4-word password to every empty bank account I ever investigated. The first time Dale and I truly spoke, he sat down beside me uninvited, took my hand in both of his, and held it a beat too long. He told me he'd lost his mother, that grief like ours was sacred. And then, so gently you'd swear it was an afterthought, he said he hated to see a woman, like me, carrying her burdens alone. And wouldn't I let him just take a look at my situation, one child of God to another? I let my eyes go wet. The grief was real, even if the helplessness was a costume. I said, "Oh, Mr. Renner, I don't understand money things. My Harold always handled all of that." I watched it land. I watched the last bit of caution leave his face, the way a cat's tail goes, still right before it pounces. Because I hadn't told him I had money, he already knew that. I told him there was no one minding the gate. "Call me Dale," he said. Over the next few weeks, I let Dale Renner court me the way he'd courted all of them. And it took everything I had not to warn Pearl. Not to stand up at coffee hour and say what he was. But I'd learned a hard lesson long ago. You cannot save people by shouting at a charming man. They'd believe Geneva's dividend check over me every time. The only thing that stops a man like Dale is to let him build the whole machine, every gear of it, and then hand the proof to the people who can take it apart. He was generous with his performance. He called every widow sweetheart and quoted the same scripture over the punch bowl he leadeth me beside the still waters, and named his company after it. Stillwater Legacy Group, in a font meant to look like old money. He'd raise a glass at every gathering and say, "To Legacy," and the women would glow. But I noticed the thing he never did. In all those weeks, all those promises, Dale Renner never once put a number in writing. He'd promise you the moon out loud, the steady returns, the no risk, the can't lose, but always spoken. Always over a handshake, always gone the instant it left his mouth. That isn't carelessness. That's craft. A spoken promise can't be subpoenaed. The day I stopped grieving and started working, I was sitting in Pearl Avery's kitchen. Pearl had given Dale everything $62,000, the whole payout from her Walter, the same kind of money I was sitting on. And Pearl had made a mistake the others hadn't yet. She'd tried to take some back. Her roof was failing, and she needed $8,000. And when she asked Dale for a withdrawal, he smiled and said the funds were in a special legacy position, and pulling them early would cost her the bonus, and wouldn't it be wiser to just roll it forward another quarter? She'd asked 3 times. 3 times he'd rolled it forward. Pearl was 81 years old, and putting buckets out in her bedroom when it rained, and she held my hand and cried, and told me she didn't want to make trouble for such a nice man. Let me tell you plainly what was happening, the way I wish someone had said it to Pearl. There was no investment. There never had been. Dale wasn't growing anybody's money, he was only moving it. He took Pearl's $62,000 and handed a little back to Geneva and called it Geneva's dividend. Then he took the next widow's money and handed a little to Pearl and called it Pearl's. The newest widow always paid the oldest. Round and round, love feeding on love, and every quarter he skimmed the cream into his own pocket. As long as fresh widows kept walking through the door, the checks cleared and everyone felt rich. But the day the new widows ran out, the whole thing would come down like a barn in a storm, and the last, biggest widow standing in the wreckage, holding nothing, was meant to be me. I was the finale. The check that would keep the music playing 1 more year, so I decided to give Dale Renner exactly the finale he was hoping for. Just not the one he'd written. I started at my kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, and what I did took less time than it takes to boil an egg. I opened the public registration database, the free record that tells you in plain black letters whether a man is licensed to touch a single dollar of your money, and I typed in Dale Renner. Nothing. No license. No registration anywhere. A man cannot legally take your savings to invest and call himself an advisor without being registered, and Dale Renner was registered to do nothing at all. Then I searched his company. Stillwater Legacy Group did not exist, not as any registered firm, anywhere. It lived on a checkbook and a business card, and nowhere else. Then I picked up the phone and called a woman named Ruth, who'd worked the affinity unit beside me for 20 years, who I'd trained myself. I asked her to run a name for me. I told her I had a feeling, and Ruth knew what my feelings meant. She called me back that evening, and her voice was careful. "Margaret," she said, "the man you're describing isn't Dale Renner. Under his real name, there's already an order against him, a cease and desist. 2 states over. Different church. Different choir director. A whole room of widows he bled 3 years ago before he folded his tent and drove east to find a new flock. I sat there in my kitchen with the phone in my hand and thought, there it is. He'd done it before. He'd do it again. And every single thing those women needed to protect themselves had been sitting in the open the whole time, free, waiting, the license check that takes 5 minutes, the order anyone could have found. The con doesn't work because the truth is hidden. It works because nobody believes they need to look. But a paper trail of other people's money only takes you so far. To finish him, I needed Dale Renner to incriminate himself, in his own hand, about my money specifically. And that meant giving him the one thing he wanted most. So I invited Dale to my home for tea, and I told him Gary was right, I'd been a foolish old woman, and I was ready to put it all in, the whole insurance payout, into his legacy position, so I could leave something behind for the church, the way Harold would have wanted. I watched the greed move behind his eyes like a fish under ice. Then I took Harold's pen out of my coat pocket and set it on the table between us, and I said, Dale, my memory isn't what it was. Before I sign over everything Harold left me, I need you to write it down for me, in your own hand, the return you're promising so I don't get confused. My Harold always said a promise you won't put on paper isn't a promise, it's just weather. And I slid Harold's pen across the table to him. For the first time, he hesitated. The smile held, but something moved behind it. "Why on paper?" he said lightly. "None of my other ladies need it on paper. We trust each other, don't we, Margaret?" And there it was, the flicker. The instinct that says, don't write it down. I made my hands shake, which at my age does not take much acting, and I let my eyes fill, and I said, "I know, dear. It's only that I'm so afraid of getting it wrong." Harold did all this. I just feel safer. He looked at the trembling old woman across the table, the forgettable face, the biggest check in the county, and he decided I was exactly as harmless as I'd spent 40 years teaching men to believe I was. He picked up my husband's pen, and he wrote it down. The guaranteed annual return. The words can't lose, and guaranteed, and no risk. In his own hand. He signed it with a flourish with Harold's pen. The very pen I'd used to sign findings against men exactly like him for 38 years, and he capped it and slid it back to me, smiling, never knowing he'd just handed me the only thing I'd ever needed. I should tell you the trap nearly came apart that same week, because Gary almost ruined everything. Gary, trying to impress Dale, trying to be useful, let something slip. He told Dale not to mind his Aunt Margaret's funny questions, because she'd worked for the state once, some office job, paper pushing, nothing to worry about. And Dale Renner, who had survived 3 years and 2 states by reading rooms, went very quiet. Gary told me about it himself, laughing, not understanding what he'd done. 2 days later, Dale stood up at the close of the Sunday service and made an announcement. He was so moved by the love of this church, he said, that he was opening a new protected legacy fund, the safest he'd ever offered, and he wanted every one of his ladies in it. He'd be collecting at a special evening that Thursday, an appreciation evening, right there in the fellowship hall, and the new fund would close that Friday morning. After that, the doors were shut. I understood exactly what I was looking at, because I'd seen it a dozen times. A man who's been spooked, whose well is running dry, doesn't just leave. He throws one last party, gathers every dollar he can into one new account on a Thursday night, and is 3 states gone by Friday afternoon with the widow's money-riding shotgun. The new protected fund wasn't a fund. It was a getaway car. I called Ruth that night and told her we'd run out of time. And for the first time in this whole story, the floor dropped out from under me. An emergency freeze on his accounts needed a filing and a judge's signature, she said. And the soonest anyone could stand in front of a judge was the start of the next week. After Friday. After the money was gone. After Pearl's roof, and Dot's savings, and Geneva's whole trusting heart had vanished into the back of that car. I sat in the dark of my kitchen, and for one long night it looked, for all the world, like Dale Renner was going to win. And then I remembered what I had in my coat pocket. I had a written guarantee, in his own hand. I had a documented solicitation of a specific large sum mine, with a date and a witness. And I had a man with an existing order against him, who was about to stand up Thursday night, in front of 100 people, and collect money he had no legal right to touch. That is not a case that waits for next week. That is an emergency happening in real time, in a room you can put investigators in. The appreciation evening wasn't his finale anymore. It was mine. And it fell on Thursday, the night before the car was meant to leave. I called Ruth back, and I told her to bring her people. To the church. Thursday, the afternoon before the evening, Pearl Avery knocked on my door, and that hour was the hardest of the whole thing, harder than burying Harold, in a way I'm not proud of. Pearl was frightened. Dale had told her the only way to keep her dividends coming was to move into the new protected fund, and she'd decided to do it. She'd decided to put in her last money, a small certificate of deposit she'd kept separate from everything. $1,100, her burial money, the cash set aside so her children wouldn't have to scrape for her funeral. She sat in my front room, turning her wedding ring around and said, "Margaret, do you think I'm doing the right thing? You're so sensible. Tell me I'm doing the right thing." And I could not tell her. Because if I warned Pearl, Pearl would warn Geneva out of love, and Geneva would warn Dale, and Dale would be gone before Thursday with everything. The only way to save Pearl's burial money, and Dot's, and Geneva's, and all of it was to let her walk to the very edge of the cliff and trust me to catch her before she stepped off. So I held my oldest friend's frightened hands, and I lied to her with my silence. And I said only, "Pearl, come to the appreciation evening tomorrow. Sit with me in the front. Don't sign anything until you've sat with me. Promise me that." And she promised, because I was sensible, and she trusted me. I watched her go, carrying her burial money toward a man who meant to bury her with it, and I have never wanted so badly to break a silence. I kept it one more night. For her. The Stillwater Legacy Appreciation Evening was the happiest room Dale Renner ever stood in. He had a caterer. He had the banner with the old money font. He went table to table handing out dividend checks like a man handing out Christmas, and every widow who took one beamed, not knowing she was holding the next widow's stolen grief. He raised his glass. "To legacy," he said. He said it 4 times that night, to 4 different tables. To legacy. To legacy. And not once, not one single time did he say the name of a single dead husband whose money was paying for the wine. He didn't know their names. He'd never bothered. The men were just the source of the funds. The widows were just the doors. I sat in the front row in my good blue dress, with Harold's pen in my pocket, and Pearl's hand in mine, and I let the whole structure assemble itself one last time, clear as a ledger Geneva paying for the lights, Pearl's roof money paying for the catering, every smiling face a column in a book that was about to be closed. And I felt the grief and the anger settle into something very old and very steady. Not rage. Rage is loud and useless. This was the quiet I used to feel right before I walked into a hearing room. The feeling of a thing that is finally, certainly, going to be set right. Then Dale tapped his glass and smiled out at all of us. "Friends," he said, "I want to introduce someone very special. A woman who has trusted me with her family's whole legacy. I think she has a few words. Margaret?" And I stood up. I took the microphone from his hand, thanked him, and told the room I had something to share and that I'd written it down, because at my age I didn't want to get confused. I took out a single folded paper, put on my reading glasses, and the room went warm and expectant, waiting for the old widow to bless the man who'd robbed them. I unfolded Dale's own handwriting, and I read it out loud. Every word of the guarantee he'd written at my kitchen table, the returns no honest man alive can promise, the words can't lose and guaranteed, and no risk in his hand, in his ink. I read it slowly, so everyone could hear, and I watched the smile begin to die on Dale Renner's face. Then I told them what I'd done for a living, because Dale never asked. 38 years, the State Securities Division. The Affinity Fraud Unit, the men who hunt good people through their own churches. I told them I'd written the training manual the young examiners still use, and I watched it travel across that room, face to face, every widow turning to look at the forgettable woman from the back pew who'd never once made a fuss. And then I gave them the rest, that his name wasn't Renner, that Stillwater Legacy Group did not exist in any registry in this country, that he was not licensed to manage $1 of anyone's money, and that this wasn't something I'd had to dig for. It was free. It was public. Any one of us could have found it in the time it takes to boil an egg. I told them about the order, 2 states over, the other church, the other choir, and I told them what the dividend checks really were. I held up Geneva's, and I held up the dates beside it, And I said, Geneva, sweetheart, this beautiful check in your hand was never a dividend. It's Dot's life insurance. And Dot, the check you're holding tonight, is Pearl's. There was never any investment. He was only ever handing each of you the next woman's grief, and calling it a gift. He liked to quote the psalm, I said. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He named his company for it. He left out the next part, the valley of the shadow. He was the valley. He just walked you in so gently you didn't feel the ground tilt. The hall had gone perfectly silent. Geneva was staring down at the check in her hand as if it had begun to move. Dale started toward me, and his voice came out smooth and reaching, the old key turning in the old lock. Margaret, now there's been a misunderstanding. Let's all just calm down. And for 1 second, the mask slipped. I was close enough to see it, when he understood it was over, and the warmth ran out of his face all at once. What was underneath wasn't a frightened man. It was a cold one. He looked out at that room full of grieving women he'd been feeding off for months, and something contemptuous moved across his face, and he said, low, almost to himself, they wanted to believe it. Every one of them. I just let them. That was the truest thing he said all night. And that was when the 2 examiners who'd been standing quietly at the back of the fellowship hall all evening, the ones I'd asked to come, the ones nobody had given a second look, started up the center aisle with their credentials already out. I said, Dale, you saved me for last because you thought I'd be the easiest, the oldest, the loneliest, the biggest check in the room. You read every widow in this church. You should have read my resume. He didn't run. There was nowhere to run. He'd held his triumph in a room with 1 door, and I was standing in it. I'll tell you how each thread ended, because you stayed this long, and you've earned the whole truth. Because Dale stood up Thursday night and collected money he had no right to touch, in front of investigators, with a written guarantee already in their hands, and an existing order under his real name. It was no longer a case that had to wait for next week. It was an emergency, and it was acted on that night. His accounts were frozen before Friday morning ever came, before the getaway car could leave the driveway. The new protected fund collected nothing. Stillwater Legacy Group's pretty checkbook was closed for good, and he will answer, under his real name this time, for the order he broke, and for every widow in that room. The money, not all of it. I won't lie to you. Never all of it, but far more than anyone expected, was clawed back out of the accounts that froze in time. The widows who'd been paid fake dividends had to return them into the pot so it could be shared out fairly, which broke some hearts, but was the only just way to do it. Pearl Avery got her burial money back untouched, because the freeze beat the transfer by a matter of hours. She got enough besides to fix her roof, and then some. She doesn't put buckets out when it rains anymore. I have checked. Geneva took it hardest, because Geneva had loved him, and because she'd been the one waving the check that brought the rest of us in. For a while, she couldn't meet anyone's eye. But here is a thing about good people: Geneva had been used, not wicked, and the church remembered the difference. She's back in front of the choir where she belongs. The first Sunday she stood up there again. Her voice cracked on the opening hymn, and every widow in those pews sang louder to carry her through it. That's the part the con man never understands. He thinks a community's love is a lock he can pick. He never learns it's also the thing that grows back. And Gary, my husband's nephew, who patted my hand and called me a foolish old woman and sold his own aunt for a finder's fee. He wasn't the mastermind, and I made sure that was understood, but he'd taken money to point a predator at frightened widows, and he had to stand up in front of that whole church and account for it and give back every dollar he'd pocketed, including the one he'd been promised for me. He doesn't come around my kitchen anymore. The last time I saw him, he couldn't meet my eyes, and I let him not meet them. Some consequences you don't have to enforce. They just sit on a man for the rest of his life, in the place where his aunt used to love him. As for me, I went back to my pew on Bellamy Road. I still bring the lemon bars. I'm still the quiet one. Mostly, though, the widows look at me a little differently now, and every so often one slides over and shows me a letter she got, or a phone call she isn't sure about, and asks me, quietly, so as not to make a fuss, whether I'd just take a look. And I always do. Because it turns out, you don't really retire from caring whether the wolves get the people you love. You only change how you do it. Harold's pen is back in my coat pocket, where it lives. A woman who's going to spend her life getting men to sign their own names had better have a pen worth signing with. Harold knew. Harold always knew. I'm 73 years old, and I've learned that the world is full of men who mistake a gentle face for an empty one, and kindness for foolishness, and grief for a door left unlocked. And I've learned that the most dangerous person in any room is very often the one everybody decided to overlook. So let me ask you something, and I'd truly like to know, if a charming man crossed a room full of your friends, smiling, with a key cut for every lonely heart in it, and he saved you for last because he was certain you'd be the easiest, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments. And tell me your age when you do, because I think there's a kind of strength that only comes with the years, and I'd like to know how many of you have it. Stay close, because I'm not finished. 2 pews over from me on Bellamy Road sits a woman named Della, a Gold Star mother, who lost her boy in a war and her husband to the years. Last week a letter came for her in the mail. A free steak dinner, a retirement seminar in a hotel ballroom, a polished young man at the front, with a slideshow promising her the secret the banks don't want her to know. I've seen that young man's name before. He used to work for Dale. That's the next story. And this time, I'm not going to wait for the appreciation evening.